So let's begin right at the start of the routine that many fight fans go through on the night of a big fight. You're up with an alarm call for Fury, Wilder, but it never used to be like that. It's how we change over the years. Back in the days, you would have been maybe going out for a few beers. You'd be coming back and devouring every fight. But these days, it changes. You have to set the alarm clock to get up to be there.
It's such a marker of impending old age, isn't it, Tim? Yeah, in the old days, sort of back in the 1990s, I would stay up all night. I wouldn't think anything of it, and I'd watch the undercard. But yeah, even then in my 30s, I'd be kind of nodding off at like 4:30 in the morning, and the fight still hasn't started. So yes, things changed. And, this book opens, as you say, in the early hours of December 2018. And yes, I'd set my alarm, and canny enough now to know that the build-up will be so long that I could get up 4:45 in the morning, be safe. The fight wouldn't have started.
19 years have passed since that last undisputed title. You were ringside for that as well. That was the night that Lewis beat Holyfield, the unfinished business fight.
Yes, absolutely. And, there'd been this quest to have an undisputed world champion at heavyweight since Lewis became in 1999. And the book ends in 2024. And finally, we do, for a brief moment, have a new undisputed world heavyweight champion who was Oleksandr Usyk, who beat Tyson Fury. So the book sort of, over these 6 years, I think it charts the ups and downs of boxing.
While all this is unfurling on screen, because this isn't just a book about boxing, going through your mind is your father back in South Africa in a nursing home with your mother who is dying, going through her last days alongside him, and your sister has passed away in September. I mean, how did this love? You said you lost the love of boxing. It was the death of your sister and this fight that helped bring it back. But how did this affect you, Mehdi? While you sat down there watching that, and then with all of the rest of this going on inside your head, thinking about life and death, how did the love manage to return at that?
I think I've sort of fallen in and out of love with boxing constantly. Dark Trade came out. It's now it's nearly 30 years ago. And even in that book, I would be fluctuating between love and almost hate. But there was a spell between, I would say, 2010 to 2018. I still liked boxing and I followed it, but my love for it had waned. But I think, Tim, the thing I need to make a distinction is between boxing as a sport, if we can use that word, and the business of boxing. I had still, loved talking to fighters, but the whole business left me cold. But I think I missed the immediacy and the urgency and sort of the excitement of being with a fighter before a fight. Because fighters are like no other sportsmen or women. They talk with such emotional candor, and it's gripping to be with them. And I think I was inching back to sort of going back to doing a book about boxing in the here or now. But then all these tumultuous events happened in my life. As you say, my mother had a terminal diagnosis. We had lost my sister shockingly in September 2018. And I think it wasn't sort of conscious decision, but I think subconsciously I just felt I want to immerse myself in boxing, in this familiar world for all its ills. It will help me just get over this difficult time in my life. So it wasn't kind of a logical decision, but I just felt I wanted to get back into boxing, sort of not so much as an escape because I was accepting what had happened to my family, but just to root myself in something that was so familiar to me.
Yeah, I think the words you used to sum that up perfectly in the book. Boxing is a refuge, for distraction for the loss suffered, and that is to come. And you wanted to remember how boxing made you feel.
Yes. I think there's a line in the book where, with a profanity in the middle of it, which I don't know what I should use now, but basically boxing makes me so, you can put in the swear word of your choice, alive. And it was the fact that I think when I am ringside for a big fight, or if I'm talking to a fighter and he or she bears their soul to me, I'm so locked into that moment, living in the present and feeling, I'm not looking back to the past. I'm not looking forward to the future. I'm living in the moment. And, most of us, it's quite difficult to live in the present because, we think back to what has happened or uncertainty about the future. And, if you can live in the moment, that's kind of a good way to do things. And certainly boxing at its best forces me to live in the moment.
You're recounting, again, in these early stages of the interview with Tyson Fury at his house in Morecambe to the two kids, and how he wanted to call the new child Jesus before being rebuked by his wife. But the moments of vulnerability that come in, that you pick up on. Yeah. I've got nothing to be upbeat about, money, titles, kids. What is the point of anything? One minute I'm fine, the next minute I want to get into a car and drive it into a wall at 100 miles an hour. Yeah, I mean, it's a very mixed up mind.
It is. And that interview, was in 2011, so 7 years before this book starts. And on the night of the fight against Wilder, I was thinking so much about that first interview I ever did with Tyson. He wasn't well known then. I think he was British champion, but certainly he hadn't entered the consciousness of the wider public. And just, I spent this morning at his little house. It was a bungalow in Morecambe because the big money hadn't come into his life yet. And it was astonishing, disturbing, upsetting because, yes, he spoke so nakedly about wanting to take his life and not seeing the point of living. And with these two little kids with him and his wife sitting in with us on the interview, I felt such, concern for him. And we did many interviews subsequently. And he often would say to me, when I'd walk into a gym, he would shout. I won't attempt to emulate his accents, but here comes the first man who saw the darkness in Tyson Fury. So we have a bit of a complicated history. But yes, those moments, although I wouldn't say I enjoyed that interview, I did feel kind of privileged to be able to talk to him, and we got past it, and I wouldn't say I helped him, but I think just talking did help him. It wasn't so much me, it was just the act of talking about it, which helped him that particular day.
The interview reminded you of the moments when you interviewed Mike Tyson for the first time, and he was talking about leaving school when he was 10 years of age. He couldn't do anything. He could barely read and write. I was an illiterate dummy, I think was the quote that he used. All I can do is fight. So there were parallels between these two people, not just fighters, for, putting themselves down or their ability to do anything down apart from, the primal get into a ring, fight. That is it.
Yeah. I always want to, with my interviews and in my books, hopefully get beyond the persona, because often these people are hugely famous. And I always want to know them as human beings. And that takes time. Sometimes you need luck to get beyond the mask that they hide behind. But both of those fighters are kind of iconic figures in the world of boxing. And with both of them, you're never quite sure which personality you're going to meet that day. Sometimes they can be charming. Sometimes they can be pissed off, a bit scary. But I've always found fundamentally, and I think this is true of most boxers, is that if you show respect and a willingness to listen and ask questions that, not just the bog standard, how was fight camp, they will engage with you and they will talk in astonishing detail about some of their innermost fears and the loneliness of boxing. And those are moments when I do feel privileged again to have that opportunity to listen to them articulate fears and confusion that is swirling about inside them.
September 2018 is when your sister passed away, and you had again another tremendously difficult thing to do, which was to tell your parents.
Yes.
Again, your mother, as you say, was suffering from breast cancer, but your relationship with your sister, you say she was somebody that you looked up to. It was a very close relationship. Yes. She was the very cool, hip sister when she was growing up. She was big into David Bowie. Yeah. She was the one that was most encouraging about you coming to London, and in actual fact drove you to the airport to get onto the plane.
Yes, we were crying. It was such a heartfelt afternoon. I was leaving South Africa. This was in 1980. It was the height of apartheid. I'd been working in Soweto. I wasn't going to go into the army because you had to go into the army for 2 years and then do camps for the next 9 years and often come back into the townships with a gun. I was just not willing to do that. And there was a finality about it. I never thought I would go back to South Africa again. So a deep sadness. But my sister was the one person I could talk to about the fact that I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to get out of apartheid South Africa. And she always told me, you can do it. She believed in me. So to lose her, she's my big sister, older than me, but she was just had her 60th birthday a few weeks before in 2018 when she died. And, she was a big influence on my life, definitely.
But I mean, there's no escaping the traumas that you're actually having to go through here, because in between the interviews and the fighters, and we've had more on Tyson Fury, but the book turns to your father who suffered a stroke on a flight to the UK. He did recover. He had an incredibly interesting life and career, and you touch on it. He was CEO of Eskom, the state electric supplier, and he'd secretly gone against apartheid, going into the townships, meeting with the ANC to bring electricity to the townships. Incredibly brave thing to do in the time that he was doing it.
Absolutely. And, that was such a lesson to me not to judge people. And I was always close to my father. But when I was young, in my teenage years and in my early 20s, understandably, I guess you're full of fire and you think you know it all. I was quite judgmental of my father because I would be going into Soweto as an English teacher in my early 20s. Bad English teacher, but those years were fantastic. I learned so much. These were kids who were being detained for their opposition against apartheid. Sometimes some of them had been tortured. And then I was having to teach them Thomas Hardy and William Shakespeare. It was kind of bizarre, but they welcomed me, and it was a wonderful time in my life. But I would leave the dusty townships at the end of the day, go back to our suburbs, which were privileged and affluent and comfortable, about 15 miles away. And I'd be ranting at my mother and father saying, you don't know what's happening in there. In Soweto, many people do not have electricity. And my dad, having started at this company as a maintenance man, as a blue-collar worker, had worked his way up to eventually be on the cusp of becoming chief executive, which he eventually did. And so I would be kind of shouting at him, what are you doing? Wake up. And it was only when I came to England that he could subsequently tell me, because I think he thought I might spill the beans, but I subsequently learned that, yes, he was going to Soweto at night, meeting with members of Nelson Mandela's band, African National Congress, to talk about ways of post-apartheid, and even before apartheid ended, electrifying the townships. Eventually, he met Mandela, and, Mandela, in those early months coming out of jail, spoke to my father about how they could work together. So an incredible person, my dad. So, yeah, the book touches a bit on his life, but also the death of my mother and my father in close succession.
Between July 23rd and November 2019, 5 deaths in boxing. And again, if you compare that to the previous years, it was 1 in 2016, 2 in 2017, and 3 in 2018. Again, you say it made me question myself and my love of this sport. But it changed again after you met Isaac Chamberlain. This was in 2019. Once this, scrawny little 11-year-old kid who was basically a drug runner from Brixton.
Yes, Isaac is perhaps the least known of the perhaps 5 or 6 fighters that feature in this book, but for me, he's the most fascinating. You've articulated exactly the start of the story for him. Is this little boy? His father had abandoned the family. His mother had been 17 when she gave birth to him. So when he was 11 and been co-opted into the gang, she was still only 28 and didn't quite know how to, help him. But eventually someone said to her, you should take him to the boxing gym. She didn't know anything about boxing, but she did that. She took him to a boxing gym in Brixton. They walked in, and he said to me, it was like mayhem. These guys were punching each other and being allowed to do it. And the smells and the colors, it was all so unusual. But, Tim, the thing that moved him the most was the fact that the trainers, he could see how they were encouraging the fighters. They were saying, well done, good work, come on, you can do better. And that's what he yearned for. He didn't have anyone who could actually nurture him. And he saw boxing as a way where he could get that support. And it gave him sort of suddenly discipline and a purpose in life. And yes, so for boxing, for all the ills which I cover, the bad side of boxing, it's so important to also talk, as we are now, about the good side of boxing and how it helps so many people.
It really did completely turn his life around, because you go into detail about the conversations that you had with him and how he was talking about seeing on the streets dealers in their flash clothes and the trainers, and it's easy to see how they are seduced by what they see. And he talks about him actually approaching the guys and saying, I want to work, and he's on his little BMX bike and he's riding slowly with his hand out. And you can just imagine it. And you've maybe seen it in films about with inner city drug dealers, hand out, taking hold of something, riding around a corner, dropping it off somewhere else. And all of a sudden you've got money in your pocket, you're getting hot food, you're in the takeaway, you can get trainers. And it's easy to see how all of these kids, the potential, without, seeing boxing as a savior, to fall the other way is so great.
Yes. And I think that for him, sort of watershed moment, he had some drugs to deliver. It was cocaine. And he was on a bus with a friend of his. And suddenly, they stopped, and the police are going to do a stop and search. So he just ran. I think he was 12 then. Not sure if the police are going to catch him, but he was quick, he dodged, and that was the moment where he said, enough is enough, and he went to the friend's sort of little council flat and said, take this, I don't want this dirty drugs anymore. Went home, showered, he was kind of crying as he's washing the vestiges of the cocaine off his body, and he thought then, no, I'm going to give this up, and I'm going to get into boxing. And he knew that his boxing trainers would cut him off if they knew he was dealing drugs. So that was such a motivation. Of course, it was difficult for him to escape the gang because they wanted him to keep working. Eventually had to chuck away his phone, cut up the SIM card, and just go into a little bit of hiding for a while. But boxing gave him sort of the hope that he could find a new life to live.
It wasn't simply a question of him walking into the gym either and picking up a pair of boxing gloves, getting in a ring, and then learning how to fight. He had to go through the whole process.
Yes.
He had to help out. He had to clean up. He had to pick up litter and rubbish. Yes. Sometimes they'd throw him a £5 note. It was the janitor, wasn't it, who began to see something there, a bit of promise. Delroy, his name was. He was the guy that began to communicate with him.
And also gave him a lot of his time. He would say to Isaac, you're good, but you can be better. You can be fitter. I think you've got to start running in the morning. So yes, the janitor would meet with Isaac at 5 o'clock in the morning and they'd go running. And so I think for Isaac, just to have someone who was willing to invest their time and their belief in him was such a boost. And, this is what boxing does. And, at the moment we hear so much about toxic masculinity and young men being lost. And that is obviously the case. It is a difficult time for young men, and they are influenced by Andrew Tate and people like this who plant poisonous ideas in their head. But just this week, I was in a gym in Manchester, and these guys, they didn't know me or anything, but they immediately, all the boxers came over, shake my hand, just kind of welcomed me there. And this is what happens in a gym. And it's still, even though I'm kind of falling out of love with boxing again, that also made me think, wow, it does so much good.
He got pushed into that promotion, Eddie Hearn, British beef with Alonso Cole. And neither of them were in double figures. He didn't deal with the loss to Cole very well.
It was too early for both of them. It was a headline bout at the O2. It was kind of crazy. And also just, I think, the way the whole fight was promoted, there was sort of overtones of, turf warfare between these two young black Londoners. Isaac, defeat felt so crushing to him. And, he went to New York. There was then a money dispute, and he just sort of lost his way. And, but eventually he pulled himself together, got a new trainer, and found, a new impetus. And, Yeah, so he would talk about these things. He would write me letters about them, which, most people think, oh, boxers, they're so dumb, but they're not. They're often highly intelligent. They might not be educated. And Isaac sort of in a way wants to be a writer. He likes to do it. So he'd send me these sometimes quite beautifully written long emails, which was so unusual. And again, I felt privileged that he felt able to share those with me.
It was New Year's Eve, wasn't it? One of the longest ones back in 2019. And he was talking about, this next year is going to be different for me. It's going to be my decade. Hennessy had taken him on and given him a deal. And suddenly he had everything to look forward to. And again, Tyson Fury talking about the mental issues. He's talking here about isolation. He said, isolation. I've been isolated for years. I've learned how to deal with isolation. If my money goes, I don't care about that either. I've been poor before. I can overcome that. So let's make it work in the ring.
And exactly as you say, in 2019, I get this message, and he's in Miami, totally alone in a not even a training camp. He's just staying in some hostel whilst he goes to the gym. But he has this conviction 2020 is going to be the big change. And then, of course, he has a fight. I think it was in sort of March 2020 scheduled, his big comeback. Of course, what happens in March 2020? Good. And suddenly all those plans are torn up. And yeah, we spoke a lot then. Obviously I couldn't meet him, but, he would email or we'd talk on the phone. And that's when he would be saying things like, I can deal with the isolation because I've been isolated. I've been lonely for a long time. So the fact that I can't leave my little flat in South London, that'll be okay. And then, yes, his next fight was in August of 2020, and he wanted me there. And it was a bizarre kind of week. These were the days when you had to be in total quarantine. So we had to spend the whole week in isolation in this hotel, which was shut to the public. And, you had to have a COVID test, which the results wouldn't come back instantly. You had to wait a long time. I think that day they came back that night. But we all were locked up in our little hotel rooms. Food would be left outside your door. And then finally we were all cleared. No one had COVID. So we could open our doors, but still had to wear the masks. And so when they did the weigh-in, they were in masks. And even before the fight, it was social distancing. It was kind of such a weird time, not so long ago, but to think we all lived in that time, it's still kind of shocking to think back to it.
And again, as we're talking about this, you're at the forefront of your mind, you're thinking about when you're going to see your father again.
Yes.
You're talking on Facebook. And then whilst you're having to deal with this, your wife's mother becomes ill and eventually moved into the community hospital. And you had to find care homes. Now, for people that have done this, of which there are many, including me, this is not an easy thing to do. And you describe one moment which an immediate light bulb came on for me because it was exactly the same. She fell out of bed onto bare floors because that's what they have. And she's back in hospital and you find out she has a brain tumor. And again, nobody is allowed to visit until the time comes where she's moved to palliative care, and then people are then allowed in. I mean, this is just, it's mental torture, isn't it? And people maybe forget about this from COVID, but anyone that had to deal with things like that will empathize greatly with what you're going through and writing about.
Yeah. COVID was such a weird time because the weather was beautiful. We had day after day, a bit like the weather this week of, blue skies and sunshine. And for a lot of people, I think COVID was a time to reconnect with their families, to not, have to go into work. And, it was kind of a special time. And often people say to me, oh, COVID was kind of fun in a way. It wasn't such fun in my family because, lost my mother the year before, and I went in Jan 2020 not knowing COVID was coming. It was it would have been my mother's 91st birthday. I just wanted to be with my dad. It was her first birthday since her death. And that was the last time I saw him. And I'm so glad I was able to go see him again in Jan 2020 because by March, travel was banned. We couldn't go. And so I knew, this last month he was doing okay. But, his death was quite quick, although he had also been given the diagnosis of cancer sort of the week of my mother's death, and didn't want to have any treatment because, life was at the end, which I accepted. And his health was fairly good. But my mother-in-law had fallen ill, and we didn't know it was a brain tumor at that stage, but she was severely ill. So I would be phoning my dad, and he would be kind of consoling us and giving us, not advice, but just buoying us up a little bit. But then suddenly he was rushed to hospital, and he had got COVID, but he died within a few days. But of course, I couldn't go back to the service for the funeral, and also my mother-in-law was so close to death too, and we finally were able to have a service which we were online for, while in a small church in South Africa, I think 16 people were allowed. And we were thinking, my wife and I, that the chances were that my wife's mother was going to die that morning. And we said, well, it just would be kind of just uncanny if she dies, and, we're about to do the service for my father. But she managed to keep going for another few weeks. But again, there was an uncanny little link there. She died on the first anniversary of my own mother's death, the 8th of August. So my wife and I, we lost our mothers both on the 8th of August, but a year between them. So the whole family was kind of dealing with a lot at that stage.
In the midst of all of this, Fury announcing a fight with AJ, and then we get the controversy with Daniel Kinahan, MTK.
Yes.
All Fury had to do, obviously, was beat Wilder. And then we have Bob Arum coming out to speak in Kinahan's favour. How did these controversies and revelations affect you? And again, because it was Fury that reignited your love of the sport. Was there a danger here with all this that was going on? It was going to douse the flames of that reignition.
Totally. And he doused the flames before, because as I said, in 2011, we had that moving interview. But then in subsequent interviews, he would be homophobic. There was doping controversy. I kind of went off him. But then with his comeback and the way he overcame his depression, he ballooned up in weight to 400 pounds, alcohol and drug addictions. He conquered those. So I was back in his corner again and sort of supporting him. But then his involvement with Kinahan became quite evident. And all that was happening whilst, my family are besieged with death. But so I was kind of following it, but also obviously my focus was on my family. But that particular infamous sort of online posting where he spoke about the AJ fight has been made thanks to Dan for making it. I couldn't believe it. Because people in boxing, they never talk about Daniel Kinahan, this infamous gangster, because they're either scared of him or they're in such cahoots with him. They don't want to expose how he had become the kingmaker in boxing. It was the unspoken dirty secret in many ways. So I couldn't believe it when he said, thanks to Dan. And the next day, the Parliament in Ireland, they were castigating this and saying, Kinahan is number one wanted criminal in Ireland, and look what he's doing in boxing. So yes, it certainly, Tim, it made me step back again and think, even though boxing has always been full of gangsters, but again, it was so in your face that Kinahan and their cartel is infamous, that they were so enmeshed in boxing.
BBC did a documentary about him. I think it was 21 or 22.
21.
Barry McGuigan came out heavily critical, saying that there was no doubt that there was an intimidation effect going on here. And even Joe Biden got involved as well, saying how they would do, whatever it took to bring this cartel or whatever to the ground. But, again, inside the fight game, you have people like Billy Joe Saunders who are coming out strongly opposed to McGuigan's views.
Yes.
So it was still a while, wasn't it, before the House of Cards came down and he was out of the game.
Just as a sort of diversion, and I didn't include much of this in the book because there was just too much death, but I'm a friend of Barry McGuigan's, and while my mother was dying, I was in South Africa, and he was phoning me and often in tears because his own daughter, Danica, was dying of cancer, and she died. It was a quick, only about a month between the diagnosis and her death. It's sad to lose your mother of 90, but to lose your daughter in her early 30s is beyond imagination. It must be horrific. Barry, I'm close to, and I so admired that on that BBC show, he actually was the only person in boxing who actually came out and spoke about the Kinahans. But boxing just continued, but it was the involvement of the FBI in 2022 came out at a media conference in Dublin, and announced that the Kinahan cartel were now amongst the most wanted people on the FBI's list. Things changed seismically then. Suddenly, the TV companies wouldn't work with MTK, who had been set up by the company set up by Kinahan, involved in boxing. Boxers were not defending him anymore. But unfortunately, my own personal belief is that I think Kinahan is still involved in boxing. I hear this more and more anecdotally, that he's still setting up deals, he's still advising fighters.
Incredible. Again, in the midst of this, your father has an obituary run in the New York Times with the headline, Ian McRae, the man who brought electricity to black South Africa. How did it make you feel to see that in the New York Times, knowing first of all that somebody actually knew about the story?
Yeah, I was surprised because my father's well known in South Africa. But yeah, I go, New York Times is so famous for its fact checking. And so I got this email from a New York Times journalist saying, oh, he's working on the obituary of my father. And he just wanted to check a few facts. So I was so surprised, that it was obviously a huge honor and showed that his impact had been significant in global terms. People knew about what he'd done. And I also thought, I don't want to labor that with another long anecdote, but, my father, incredible person, but he and my mother were born in South Africa, lived under apartheid. And when I was a little boy, we had black, what we would call servants, working in our house, either in the house or the garden. We loved them. They were almost part of the family. But I never forgot that, when I was a little boy, when we made a cup of coffee for the lady who worked for us, who was black, she had to have it in a tin mug. When she shared the food we had, she had it on a tin plate, almost as if the color of her skin would contaminate us. I wrote a book in 2012, which is a family memoir, which spoke about all these issues. And my father and mother in later years put their hands in their heads and said, what were we thinking? They felt so ashamed. It was just, I guess people who lived in Nazi Germany just got on and lived with life, lived their normal lives and didn't think about Jewish people and what was being done to them. So when that New York Times obituary came out, I also thought, wow, my father and my mother too, they came from that past where people just unthinkingly accepted apartheid and racism to the point where he's electrifying not only huge parts of South Africa, but parts of Africa that didn't have electricity. It was a fitting sort of culmination to his life.
Billy Joe Saunders. Now, you mentioned that he stood for at times everything that you disliked.
Yes.
About the sport. And there was part of you say, that wanted Canelo Álvarez to expose him in the ring. Your interview with Álvarez reminded you again of one of the first interviews that you did with Mike Tyson. Very, very intense. I mean, his story again is incredible. 3 months after his 15th birthday, not 16th, 15th birthday, he's in a boxing ring. He has a pregnant girlfriend, and it looks like he went from being a toddler and a child straight into being an adult. There was nothing in between.
Incredible. This is what boxing, why I've always wanted to write about it. The stories are unbelievable. Canelo is a Mexican but was born with red hair. He looked like he should come from Ireland, covered in freckles, and he was teased and bullied as a little boy. They would pinch him, they would mock him. And he was selling, his family had they did not much money at all. And he would sell little ice lollies for his father. And walking to the bus station or whatever, he would be taunted. And he was timid and in the shadows. And then finally, he was one of, I think, 5 boys. He was the youngest. The others were all boxers. And then finally, he decided he was going to fight back. He just had this instinctive talent. And the first guy, he bloodied his nose and he thought, I can't like this. I feel better about myself. And yes, then, with the Billy Joe Saunders fight, Canelo is now almost the best fighter in the world. And I don't ever wish ill on anyone, I don't think. And certainly boxers, I might want one boxer to beat the other boxer, but I never want them to, I never go think, I want him to hurt him. And I didn't with Billy Joe Saunders, I didn't want him to suffer. But he was full of bullshit and, had made videos where he showed people, in his words, how to shut up your woman, like how to hit a woman. They put it on the internet. He would be taunting drug addicts, just awful stuff. And he supported the Kinahans. So he epitomized most things that I just, cannot abide. And Canelo's a much quieter person and has a sort of not a menace about him, but he's a business-like kind of person. And I thought Canelo's the guy who's going to show Billy Joe Saunders, maybe don't shoot your mouth off so much. And of course he did do that. And although Billy Joe Saunders fought well, in the end he had suffered a broken orbital bone, taken to hospital. Made me question myself a bit because I didn't want that. But Saunders was badly hurt, has never boxed again since.
He did do well, didn't he? Up until literally the eighth round.
Yeah. He's a skillful boxer. I've interviewed Billy Joe before, and as a fighter, you've got to admire him.
You've seen and you've experienced much, but the sport does still have the capacity to leave you aghast. We have more theatre with the announcement of the Fury-Joshua fight. One of the many times this fight has been announced, only for 28 hours later, a judge to rule that Deontay Wilder can actually exercise his right for this third fight. And again, there's a good line from you talking about this. You say, look, Fury, much like modern boxing, often lamentable, occasionally riveting. We get the press conference with the white suits, and then we're moving back into the more theatre of the face-off, where they stand and literally look at each other for 6 minutes.
I forget how long. Was it 6 minutes?
5 minutes 39.
Wow. It's crazy, and you can't sort of take your eyes off him in a way. And then what boxing does too, it pushes these men and women to the brink of exhaustion and sometimes too close to death. He and Deontay Wilder had 3 fights, and Tyson certainly, I think, he won 2. The first was adjudged a draw, but I feel he clearly won it, even though he was knocked down twice. But in boxing, they talk about dance partners. And these 2 were kind of perfect dance partners because they both have power. They were knocking each other down. Of course, the damage it does is why we shouldn't be laughing, but it was unbelievable drama. And after the third fight, which was perhaps the best of them all, I never forget, Tyson is leaning over the ropes and he's crying with the exhaustion of it all, and also just with the enormity of what he just endured. And this is what boxing does. At its best, it's like nothing else on earth, I think.
You didn't get that, but we did get Joshua Usyk. Joshua had been inexplicably, for some, beaten by Andy Ruiz. He felt that he'd never been quite the same since that comeback victory over Klitschko. He still had this desire. He craved respect, I think he said, from the sport. Those around him wanted to protect the money-making machine. Nobody thought that it would be derailed by Ruiz. And I think a large proportion of people didn't think it would be derailed against Usyk either.
No. And this is, again, boxing. We have Andy Ruiz, who comes in as a substitute opponent because the other fighter, called Big Baby Miller, failed, positive drugs tests. So, and Andy Ruiz is, and I say this as a hardly body beautiful myself, but he's a roly-poly guy who looks like he's been, training at Domino's and not in the gym. He had no hope. And I know I was interviewed, I had to do a Zoom interview with a South African radio station, and they asked me about this fight. I said, I'm not even going to get up for this fight. It's a waste of time, Of course, one time I don't get up, I wake up, and Andy Ruiz has not only beaten Anthony Joshua, he's dismantled him and virtually knocked him out. And then, Usyk comes along, and I know he's a genuine, amazing fighter. But I also thought it was in the balance because he was so small. And when he fought Anthony Joshua, I think it was only his third fight as a heavyweight. And I kind of was 50-50. In hindsight, that was crazy because, of course, Usyk is a much better fighter than Joshua. And, that night at the Tottenham Stadium, was quite a night. Anthony Joshua, his sort of ring walk took so long because he was so confident. He was stopping to talk to people in the crowd. Usyk exposed him, and although it was quite a close fight in some ways, Usyk clearly won it.
Needed a stoppage in the last round. You talk, though, about how he showed great courage, and he does show great courage whenever he's under pressure. And he also turned up. I mean, he could have gone off and sloped off, gone to the hospital, not bothered to come back, but he's never shirked appearing in front of the public, in front of the press and the media, even if the night or the day hasn't gone his way. I know he's had the odd meltdown in the ring, but there's still something about him that I find classy, actually.
Definitely. And after that fight against Usyk, most fighters, if they lose, they don't come out to talk to the media, but Joshua did. And, I made a point afterwards. I went over to him and I just said, thank you, for coming tonight, and, bad luck and all that kind of thing. And yeah, he just put out his fist. So we bumped fists and he sort of said, no problem. And I just thought, that was a classy thing that he still came out, because it's easy if you've won the fight to come out. But boxing, if you lose a football match, it's painful. But if you a boxer, it's a lonely, lonely business, and you feel, when millions of people are watching you on television and you lose, I think it's hard. And yeah, I've got to give credit to him, Joshua. He always comes out win or lose and will face up and answer questions.
96. This is in the mess as we move toward the end of the book. You talk about your meeting with Deirdre Gagati and Christy Martin in 1996, and then going on to meet who you call one of the most courageous people that I've ever met in boxing. And I wholeheartedly agree. I've met her on many occasions, and I've worked with her on occasions as well. And we're talking about Jane Couch, the wonderful Jane Couch.
So Jane is such a special person. I think slowly people are beginning to acknowledge what a pioneer she was. In 1996, women's boxing was banned in the UK and in Ireland. Jane she was a professional, but she had to fight outside of the UK. And, she had fights where she would win them, but suffered so many broken bones. These were wars in that cliched boxing term. And yet she was hardly getting paid any money. And what Jane did, the most significant thing of all, was that she decided to take the British Boxing Board of Control to court, because there was a clear case of sex discrimination against women, and she won that case. The sadness for Jane is that even though the boxing board had to now allow women to box, she was still considered a freak, and she would be invited onto television chat shows, and they would be asking questions like, is Jane Couch a freak or not? And people would be voting. So there'd be 52% saying, yes, she's a freak, 48% saying no, whatever it was. And for Jane, this was so humiliating. And I interviewed her many years later. I forget the exact date, but I'd say maybe about 2019. And Jane shed a lot of tears with me in that interview. She knew what a big supporter I was of her, and that I'd interviewed her back in the 90s. So I think with me, she could just open up, and she just said, I wish I hadn't been the first. I wish I hadn't had to do all these things, because it messed me up emotionally as a person. And she couldn't sort of have a relationship with anyone. But by then, 2019, she was, happily, living with a man, and things were good. But she suffered enormously, and so many women owe so much to Jane. And boxing itself, I think, owes so much to Jane.
Wow, absolutely. I mean, she did suffer a breakdown after she retired. She talked about not getting into, or not being able to cope with relationships, just normal one-to-one relationships, until she's actually in her 40s.
Yes.
And you can imagine what was going through her mind, because she talked about, when I won the first world title against Sandra Geiger in her fifth fight, and she's on her way home after this momentous occasion, and she's thinking, there's going to be a line of people at the airport. I have to work out what I'm going to say. And you get home and there's nobody there. It's almost like you don't exist. There wasn't a line in the boxing press.
No. She was thinking, almost sad. Maybe I'll be on the cover of Boxing News. I've won a world title. Yeah, there's no one at the airport to meet her. Then the Boxing News comes out later the next week. There's not a line on her. And so I've spoken about the loneliness of boxing, but can you imagine the loneliness of being a women's boxer then? And Jane had to withstand that.
If there's any justice in that sport, then she should be made to be financially comfortable and secure by those that hold the purse strings. We're nearing the end, but I wanted to talk about something that really did get under your skin. I could almost feel the sense of anger as you're writing this, trying not to expose the anger as the story begins, but saving it until it actually ends, when you flip open your laptop and the anger spews out. And this was Ben, and Eubank. And it begins with you getting a 45-minute face-to-face with Conor Benn at the end of the press days. Just arrive and be discreet. You'll have your time there. And then you get to your interview, and again, many people will have been in this position. But again, I think what separates you is something that you said earlier on. When you sit down and you interview a boxer and you just go through the same, well, how did fight camp go and whatever, I always look for another angle. And so 15 minutes in, after you're thinking, right, I've had enough of this, you suddenly think something clicks and you, right, okay, we're going to completely change track here. And you've almost got a different person and a different interview when you start to talk to Conor Benn about home and life.
Yes, I was on the verge of saying to him, Conor, should we just call it quits? And then something jumped into my head, and I just said to him, what does home mean to you? And it stopped him, and he suddenly went back to his childhood. And the short version is that he'd been brought up in Spain by his dad, Nigel Benn, the famous boxer, and his mother. And Nigel had had a troubled past, but had sort of become a born-again Christian and sent Conor to this sort of evangelical Christian school where Conor was told as a little boy that he's going to burn in hell and the devil is watching him. And Conor was saying, how can you say this to a little boy? And that was one of those interviews again where there were tears. Conor shed a lot of tears. And I left the interview thinking, what a moving interview, and how boxing again has this capacity to make me change my mind. And I've been so skeptical about the Eubank Jr. Benn fight. I just felt it was manufactured, built on the enmity between their fathers. They're not the same weight divisions. They should not be fighting. They're just doing it for money. But I came away kind of fascinated by Conor Benn and thinking, wow, I actually wonder what is going to happen in this fight. That piece was published the following Monday in The Guardian. And then on the Tuesday, and there was a lot of positive feedback. People saying, oh, Conor, well done for speaking so openly. And then on the Tuesday, mid-morning, suddenly got news that there was a positive dope test for Conor Benn. And I swore, because I thought, typical boxing, just gets me back in it. But then I started thinking, Tim, actually, this is good. If a fighter has got performance-enhancing drugs in their system, it's good that it's been exposed. But then those feelings changed to anger, because as the day wore on, I began to see that Eddie Hearn, Conor Benn, and others were attempting to salvage the fight and to proceed with it that Saturday night, even though there was a positive dope test. We didn't know at that stage there had been 2 positive dope tests. So by the time the fight week came to Thursday, and it was still in the balance, and we were called to a media conference, and there was a lot of speculation that they were going to be able to proceed. I was full of anger because I know what boxing does. This is not high jumping. If you dope, you're not going to harm anyone. If you're a boxer and you've got dope in your system, you can kill them. And the Benn family, the Eubank family, had been scarred by boxing tragedies they had been involved in, which I documented in Dark Trade. The Hearn family had also been scarred by boxing tragedy in fights they had promoted. I could not believe they were going to go ahead. Finally, they at the nth hour, they pulled the plug. But yes, that was the moment where I thought, I can't write another book about this boxing business ever again because of that week.
It's rare that I saw your cool slip or, emotion to take over, but it was at the press conference, wasn't it, when they came out and they said, Hearn and Sauerland will be out in 5 or 10 minutes time, but there will be no questions. And you almost had an involuntary reaction of what? What I was amazed at was that it ended with what, and there was no.
Well, I'm genuinely a shy person, and I'm quiet. Even though I'm babbling away, talking a lot, I'm good at talking. Well, not good, but I tend to talk a lot. But I'm actually fundamentally a quiet person. The last person I think you would imagine to shout out anything at a press conference. But that day I did shout out, what? I just couldn't believe it, because now is the time to be accountable. But of course, they wouldn't take any questions.
Lastly, the book ends with Fury Usyk. But it's not about the fight, because there are contrasting emotions for you, because you're trying to get your head around it. Saudi money is reshaping boxing here. Many people have got a view. What about the human rights? What do we do about Turkey al-Sheikh. How do these two marry together? Manil al-Otaibi, imprisoned for 11 years for those alleged terrorism offences, and a whole host of other people. These things are going on, or these people are imprisoned, literally moments away from where all this glitz and the glory is. I can sense that there is a battle. There's there's a boxing Donald McRae, and then there's the journalist Donald McRae, somebody who, you grew up with apartheid and everything that went on there. And I can see that this is battling for your emotions here.
I think, Tim, the battle was soon won by hopefully the human being inside me. Yes, I'm a boxing fan and I'm a boxing writer, but actually, fundamentally, I'm just a human being. And when I went to Riyadh, it was important I spoke to not only the boxers, but people who lived there and people who have family members who've been detained for more than 10 years for innocuous criticism of the state or for the kind of dress they wear. Other family members are awaiting execution. Those stories are haunting. And of course, is Tyson going to be able to outbox Oleksandr Usyk? Of course, I was caught up in that. But as the weeks wear on, you soon work out actually what's important here is the human rights issue. So, for me, it wasn't so much a battle internally. I would cover the boxing, and yes, I would get caught up in it because there were some amazing fights that I saw in Saudi. But for me, the most important thing were the human rights issues.
So there it is. The book draws to a close, and with it, the last words that you're ever going to write on in terms of books. But of course, being around so many people that have made grand comebacks, I mean, is there any chance that maybe 2 years down the line you just think, well, why not?
Well, be the biggest boxing cliche of them all. Boxers always make comebacks. So yes, I was a bit hesitant to sort of initially say, this is going to be my last book, because I thought, well, what happens if there's an amazing story in a few years? That might happen. But I think fundamentally there's so much else I want to write books about. I'm going to still continue to cover boxing in detail, hopefully become a better journalist than I've been, because I think I've paid sometimes too much attention to the emotional side of boxing and the human side of boxing and the writing side of boxing. And maybe I need to ask harder questions than I've done up until now. So I will continue to follow boxing, and I'll be telling you I love it, I hate it. It'll be a constant fluctuation between the two.
Do you know, it's funny, isn't it? Because boxing as the sport, and boxing in terms of literature, you could be not a fan of the sport itself, but the books make fabulous sporting literature in a way that other sports cannot get near. Football doesn't come close to it. It just doesn't touch the emotions, the human emotions, the stories that boxing gets close to. It's unlike any other sport, certainly in terms of books and literature.
Definitely. And, I've often thought, if I wasn't a writer, I think I would have actually turned my back on boxing a long time ago. So maybe, there's a nasty side of me is that I'm sort of using boxing for these amazing stories it gives me. But when you get to know the fighters, you're swept away by the color, the drama, the sadness, the madness of it all. And I've been privileged I've written 5 books out of the 14 of mine have been about boxing. And wow, it's been quite.
Which was your favorite one? I know this is like asking a rock band or an artist. Which is the favorite one? Yeah. It's this one.
It's so hard to pick. Dark trade is important to me because in a way that gave me the ability to become a full-time writer. This one I think is important to me because I think it's the most honest of all the books and the most meaningful to me. But then if I just pick out 2 others just quickly, A Man's World about Emil Griffith, a gay world champion boxer. Wow, what a story that was. And then also perhaps in some ways, the most favorite of them all to research was In Sunshine or in Shadow, which was about boxing in the Troubles in Northern Ireland and how boxing could actually do so much good and unite people across the sectarian divide. And that's a hopeful boxing book. So maybe that one, just in terms of pleasure, I would pick In Sunshine or in Shadow as the one that perhaps I enjoyed the most.